Hello and welcome to this lecture, the first of a number of lectures on Marxism. And this lesson is particularly focusing on class analysis. And the opening line of the Communist Manifesto, written in 1848 by Marx and Engels, was that the history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles. So really, they're saying all history is really shaped by, conditioned by class struggle. And the aim of this lecture is really to give you an understanding of what exactly they're getting at, what they mean by this idea that all history is actually the history of class struggle. So, to begin with, what do we mean by class? Class, in Marxist terms, one's class is defined by one's relationship to what's called the means of production. Okay, now the means of production, by the means of production, all we mean is the equipment and resources necessary for producing goods. So things like land, mines, steelworks, factories, and so on. The things, the tools, the equipment, the resources you need to produce goods. So your class is something that is defined by your relationship to those things. In particular, do you own them or not? Right? So in modern society, Marx and Engels analyzed, modern society, there are three main classes. And each of them are defined by what they own, right? So first of all, you have the aristocracy who own the land. You have the bourgeoisie who own the factories and businesses. And then you have the proletariat who own nothing. Or to be precise, they own nothing except their ability to work. That is their capacity for labor. So the proletariat is the class who have nothing to sell except their own labor power. That's the Marxist definition of the proletariat. When we say working class, that's more or less synonymous with proletariat. More or less means the same thing. Not exactly, but we needn't worry about the precise differences for now. Proletariat, you can think, basically means the working class. So these three classes each have a different relationship to the means of production, which also means that they have a distinct way of making money or making an income. So pause the video here for a second and consider how each of these three classes make money. How do they each make an income? Okay, how do landowners make an income? What do they make their money from? The aristocracy, that is. How do the bourgeoisie, the owners of factories and businesses, what do they make their money from? How do they make an income? And what do the proletariat make an income from? How do they make money? Okay, pause the video and consider that. Okay, so to put it simply, the aristocracy make their money through rent. Okay, collecting rent on the property and land that they own. The bourgeoisie make their money through profit. Yeah, profit made from the production and sale of goods or services. And the proletariat earn their income from work, from wages. Yep, as I say, or selling their capacity to labor, selling their labor power. Yep, so aristocracy make money from rent, bourgeoisie from profit, and proletariat from wages, working for a wage. And because these three all make their money or make an income in different ways, from different things, they all have, for Marxists, they all have distinct, what we can call class interests. And by class interests, we simply mean what is of advantage to that class, what is going to benefit members of that class. Okay? So the point of each of these three classes having distinct class interests mean that different things are going to be advantageous or beneficial to these different classes. What's beneficial to one might not be beneficial to another, and so on. So, for example, higher wages are clearly in the class interests of the proletariat because they make their living from wages. So wages go up, that's good for them. They materially benefit from that. But higher wages are against the class interest of the bourgeoisie because they're the ones, the factory owners, business owners, etc. They're the ones who are going to be paying the higher wages. So it's going to mean they make less profit. So because they get an income from profit, high wages is actually detrimental, is negative to their class interests, whereas in the interests of the proletariat. So that's just one example of an issue where the class interests of the bourgeoisie and the proletariat are opposed, are at odds with one another. So again, In a second, I want you to pause the video here and try to think of another example, another issue, another policy perhaps, or another thing where the class interests of the bourgeoisie, the owners of businesses and factories and so on, and the proletariat, the workers, are opposed. Yep, so pause the video and think of one other issue where that's something that might be of benefit to one but detrimental to the other. Okay, so you might have thought of things like, for example, the redistribution of wealth. Yep, taxing profits, for example, to pay for things like public services, benefits, and other things that are most likely to benefit the proletariat. Now, these would be against the class interests of the bourgeoisie, yeah, because it's taxing from their profit, but they'll be in the class interest of the proletariat because they're going to benefit from the services and so on. Other things might be things like the regulation of working conditions. Yep, laws, for example, requiring that workers will be given a lunch break, or that the workers be allowed paid holidays or sick pay, things like that. All of this is going to come at the expense of profit, yep, and it's therefore against the class interest of the bourgeoisie, but it's all in the interest of the proletariat because it improves their working conditions, their working life. Yep. So it helps to understand Marxism. It really helps if you've had a job. The more exploitative job, the better. It really gives you a better understanding of Marxism if you've had a job where you've been really badly treated and had really low pay. So if you want to really understand this unit and you don't have a job, so just go out and get a really bad job in a big retail corporation like Sports Direct or something, and all this stuff will resonate with you a lot more clearly. Now, so according to Marxists, in modern capitalist society, these are the two great classes, right? The bourgeoisie and the proletariat. And the interests are fundamentally opposed. They're irreconcilable. They're at odds with one another. Yeah, what's good for one is bad for the other, and vice versa. But there are also contradictions between the aristocracy and the bourgeoisie. So, for example, high land rents are good for the aristocracy because they make their money from rent, so higher rent, more money for them. But they're against the class interests of the bourgeoisie because they will have to be paying higher rent for the factories that their land is on, and so on and so forth. So the aristocracy and the bourgeoisie have different class interests when it comes to things also like tariffs, that is, taxes on imports. So traditionally, the aristocracy in England, for example, supported high tariffs on, for example, imported wheat. Pause the video, in fact, here and think about why would the aristocracy support high taxes on imported wheat, and why would the bourgeoisie be opposed to that? Okay, basically, this was because the aristocracy didn't want the wheat that was grown on their land to be undercut by cheap imports, by cheap foreign imports of wheat. So, but as a result of these high tariffs, which were good for the aristocracy, they could charge higher rent to farmers because they were getting high price for the wheat. As a result of these tariffs, the factory owners, the bourgeoisie, had to pay higher wages to their employees, because the price of bread was higher, and they needed their workers to be able to eat, else they wouldn't be able to make it back to the factory the next day. So they were having to pay higher wages because of these tariffs. They didn't want to do that. So that's another example where the interests of the aristocracy and the bourgeoisie were opposed as well. So there was actually, in this example I've been looking at, there was a big battle between the aristocracy and the bourgeoisie on this exact issue, on the issue of imported wheat tariffs, which were known as the Corn Laws, which eventually led to those laws being scrapped in 1846, ushering in a period of free trade where there was not import taxes and tariffs and so on. This was seen as a big victory for the bourgeoisie over the aristocracy. So you can see that this way of interpreting events through the lens of class and class interest is quite a powerful tool of analysis for understanding historical and political events. So let's go back to that opening line of the Communist Manifesto. All hitherto existing society is the history of class struggle. What this means then is that all the great historical events and struggles, they're all a manifestation of the different class interests, opposing class interests of the forces involved. And in particular, Marx and Engels saw the great liberal revolutions. Pause the video here, just a little bit of revision. What were the three great liberal revolutions in the 17th and 18th century? Okay, so we're talking about the liberal revolutions, we're talking about the Glorious Revolution in England in 1688, talking about the American Revolution of 1776 against British rule, and we're talking about the French Revolution of 1789, where the king was executed and so on. So these three great liberal revolutions were seen by Marx and Engels as essentially revolutions of the bourgeoisie against the aristocracy. This was how they interpreted them. This is what we mean by history being the history of class struggle. These great historical events are manifestations of struggles between different classes with different class interests. So what all these revolutions did, in fact, for Marx and Engels, from their point of view, was effectively remove political power from the aristocracy and put it in the hands of the bourgeoisie. So this meant that the bourgeoisie were able to then use the power of the state to benefit their own class interests. Yep. So, for example, a few examples. Following the Glorious Revolution in England, for example, we see things like the establishment of a central bank in 1694 to facilitate trade and give merchants access to capital. Yeah, it's obviously something that was pushed for by the bourgeoisie. Secondly, after the Glorious Revolution, you saw restrictions on the sale of land ended. So now factory owners wouldn't necessarily have to rent land from aristocrats at a high level to build their factories on. They could actually buy that land instead. Thirdly, we saw after the Glorious Revolution the ending of royal monopolies on trade. Yeah, the ending of the royal monopolies on trade. So before 1688, each export trade was run by just one company, who was the only company that was allowed to trade in that field. Yeah, so there was just one sugar trading company, just one tobacco company, and crucially just one company, the Royal African Company, that was allowed to basically run the slave trade, yeah, the trade in kidnapped human beings, kidnapped Africans in particular. So all of these companies were established by what's called the Royal Charter, a Royal Charter. In other words, the king would create a company to trade in that particular field, and then that would be the only company allowed to do so. And it was usually controlled by one leading aristocrat, often a member of the royal family. Yeah. So the bourgeoisie, they wanted access to these lucrative foreign markets. Yeah. So once they had taken power, they ended those royal monopolies. And now anyone was allowed to set up their own company and start trading in sugar, spices, tobacco, or indeed kidnapped human beings. In fact, following the Glorious Revolution, so-called, of 1688, you actually saw a massive expansion of the kidnapping and enslavement of Africans as more and more companies now entered the field. And actually the century that followed the Glorious Revolution was the biggest century in terms of the number of kidnapped and trafficked Africans in the transatlantic slave trade. So a massive blossoming of the slave trade. So this was Marx and Engels' understanding of the so-called liberal revolutions, right? That they were in fact revolutions really that benefited a particular class, namely the bourgeoisie. And actually they saw ideologies, the various ideologies, really as sets of ideas, all of which purported to represent a sort of universal interest, all of them purported to be good for humanity. But actually for Marx and Engels, each ideology represented the interests of a particular class. Yeah, so pause the video here for a moment and think, which ideologies do you think represented the interests of each class? Which ideology represented the interests of the bourgeoisie? Which ideology represented the interests of the aristocracy? And which ideology represented the interests of the proletariat? Okay, pause the video and do that. So hopefully you figured it out, right? Liberalism, this is Marx and Engels' understanding. Liberalism was an ideology that represented specifically the class interests of the bourgeoisie. Conservatism was an ideology that mainly represented the interests of the aristocracy, and socialism was the ideology that represented the interests of the proletariat. So what Marx and Engels believed needed to happen was that just as the bourgeoisie had overthrown the aristocracy, which they saw as a good thing, by the way, they saw that as a progressive step, progress in history, just as the bourgeoisie had overthrown the aristocracy in the English, American and French revolutions, so now did the proletariat need to overthrow the bourgeoisie in their own socialist revolution. Really, this was what the Communist Manifesto was all about. I would just add one last thing at this point, which is that Marx and Engels believed, however, that although the other ideologies only represented the interests of a particular class and didn't really represent the interests of the whole of humanity, they did believe actually that socialism, as well as being in the specific interest of the working class, they believed socialism was actually in the interest, genuinely was in the interest of all of humanity. And this was because they believed that socialism was alone was able to end the persistent economic crises and wars generated by capitalism, and usher in a period of equality and freedom, actually, but a more genuine type of freedom, they believed, and that advocated by the liberals, would usher in a equality and freedom that would actually benefit all. And we're going to look at why they believed that, what they understood capitalism to be and to generate in the next lecture.